Welcome to part 7 of creating visual VFX in Blender. In this video we're going to be creating a shadow only material for use in compositing in images like this one that's on your screen right now. In this image, which is a real life photograph, I've composited on top of it 3D text, but the important part here is the shadows that are cast by the 3D objects, in this case words or letters, onto the ground. This is tricky to do in Blender cycles, so let's go ahead and dive in and I'll show you how to do this. Specifically in this video I'll be talking about how to create a shadow only material. We'll also be learning how to adjust shadows to make them look like they really exist in the scene depending on the scene's lighting. We'll be talking about doing some rough camera matching to create this image to make it look like your camera matches the same as the camera in your still image or movie shot on a tripod. We'll also be talking about digital color grading, which will sell your final image by adding some color adjustment and brightness and contrast adjustment to your entire image. Let's go ahead and jump in. I'll click on my splash screen to get rid of it. And the first thing I'll need to note is that we have to change our render engine over from the old Blender render engine over to the Cycles render engine. This changes, of course, the way that you light your scene in 3D, the way you texture your scene in 3D, and it changes some of the nodes that are available to us to help us composite. So that's very, very important. We want two windows to do this. Let's go ahead and grab this little crosshatch area up here and we'll left click and drag it to the left to split this window into two. I'm going to keep a 3D viewport over here, but I'm going to change this window type down here to a node editor window. Let's go ahead and change it from material nodes over to compositing nodes, and I'll click on use nodes and backdrop. Of course, when I use nodes, compositing nodes, it gives us two nodes and a noodle connecting them by default. A render layers node, which we actually will be using in this video, as well as a composite node for outputting or rendering our final scene. Great, let's leave those for a moment. Let's go ahead and set up our 3D scene, which has a camera, a lamp, and a cube. You can right click to select objects in Blender, of course. I'm going to select that default cube. I don't want it, so I'll press X on my keyboard with it selected and I'll click on delete. I will press Shift A though, and to bring up the add menu, Shift A, and I'll add a mesh plane, which gives us a little square for our ground, which we'll be making look like only shadows and not actually a ground. And I'll press S on my keyboard and pull out to scale that plane. I'm going to press Shift A one more time and we're going to add text. If you haven't used text in Blender before in 3D, basically, and in fact I'll press Z on my keyboard to go into wireframe mode so I can see it a little bit easier. With text, it gives you the word text, but if you press tab to go into edit mode, you get this little cursor and you can press backspace on your keyboard a few times and then you can type whatever you want. In this case, I'm going to type shadow only, and then that's the whole text right there. I'll press tab to go back into object mode now, and I want this text to actually be not two-dimensional. I want it to be 3D. So over here under the font tab in the properties window, which is only available if you have the text selected, I'm going to change the extrude amount. I'll click and drag, and as you can see the text is getting to be 3D. That looks pretty good to me. I'll press Z to go back into solid view, and I'm going to rotate it so it's sitting on the ground. So I'll press R and then X and 90 to rotate it up, and then enter. So it's sitting on the ground. That's R, X, and then 90, and then enter. Great. Let's go ahead and press 0 now with our mouse in this window. 0 on your number pad will switch over to your camera. And I'm going to adjust how my camera is pointing to sort of match that dock picture that I had on the screen a few moments ago. So if I try to orbit now through my camera, which is of course pushing your mouse wheel down like a button and moving your mouse, it actually breaks out of the camera by default. But I want to fix that, so I'm going to press N on my keyboard, and then under View, and by the way you can press this little plus as well, I'm going to click under View on Lock Camera to View, and that means now that I can orbit while looking through the camera, and it'll change my camera's location and rotation. Of course I can hold Shift and pan and zoom as well. Let's go ahead and put it right about there. I'm going to press R now, and then Z with the text selected. I want to point sort of backwards. Great. Let's go ahead and set up our compositing now. So I'll make this window a little bit bigger over here. We don't want now only one render layer. By default, when you go to the camera tab and you press render, it only renders out one image of how your entire scene looks with all of the lighting and everything in one picture. We don't want that. We actually want to separate the text that's in our scene or the objects that we put in the image from the ground that will only show up as shadows. So the first thing I'll do actually is select this ground, and I'm going to press M on my keyboard, and that will move that ground or bring up this move to layer pop-up. I'm going to move everything down to a layer below, or this plane rather, to the layer below. If you're not familiar with layers, they are down here on the header of your 3D viewport, and they're basically like parallel universes. That means that they can have different objects in different parallel universes, essentially, where you can put some things in one and some things in another, and you have a whole bunch of empty ones that you can use. And if you hold Shift and then click on different ones, you can combine or overlap those parallel universes to all be in the same place or overlapped. I want to have the ground in this bottom one and everything else in this top one, everything else being the light, the camera, and the text. And I'll hold Shift to have them both visible. Great. That's important because we're going to separate those out in what are called render layers. And those are found under the second tab. In fact, I believe it's called the Render Layers tab. Right now we have one render layer, just called Render Layer. I'll double click on that, and I'm going to name it Objects. Great. And I'm going to create another render layer by clicking on this little plus. And I'm going to call this one, just by double clicking on it, Shadows Only. Great. Now, how these work, and it's a little bit confusing until you get used to them, is you can actually separate what objects are in different renders. So Blender will actually have to do a few different render passes to get a whole complete image, and that's actually okay. It gives you longer render times, but there are benefits to it. Basically, with this objects render layer selected, I want to make sure that it only renders the content on this top layer. The text, the light, and the camera and light are not rendered, but the light will be. So I'm going to click under layers here, this top layer only with objects selected. And I want to make sure both render layers or both scene layers are recognized though by both of these render layers. So this objects render layer will only render out this layer, and then shadow only will only render out that layer with the ground. But both render layers need to know about all of the layers that are actually in the scene. It's a little bit confusing, but just match mine. This shadow only layer also needs a different type of pass, and that's under here, under passes. This shadow only render layer will need to know about shadows as well. So when you enable shadows, it actually includes more information in the render and not just like pixels of an image. It'll actually know where the shadows specifically are in the scene and allow us to access those. That's very important for the shadow only layers. Great, let's go ahead now and do a render, but the first thing we have to do actually is make the background of our renders transparent. Right now it'll render out like gray as the sky and not transparency. So under the camera tab, way down under film, I want to check transparent. And that will mean that when we do a render for both passes, the background will be transparent and not gray. Let's go ahead and do the rendering. I'm going to scroll up under the camera tab back to render, and I'll click on it to render it out. And you'll notice that in its first pass, because we checked transparent, we get this checkerboard and it only rendered the text. And in the second pass, it'll render the ground with the shadows on the ground. And again, the above section up here will be transparent as well. So now we have two passes rendered, and it's only actually showing us for our final render, it switched back to the text because that's how our nodes are set up. So let's go ahead and fix that. Yes, it does take longer to render out two different passes, but again, there are benefits to it. Let's go ahead and press escape. As you can see, it's only rendering out the objects to our final composite, and that's why we didn't see the ground. But I'm going to duplicate this node, so with it selected, I'll press Shift D. I'm going to change this render layers node to render out or include the shadows only, the second render layer. Great, so you can see thumbnails of those because I've already rendered out. I've clicked that button once. As you probably know if you've watched other videos in this series, that we combine images when we're compositing using what's called the alpha over node. That lets you stack images one above the other. So let's go ahead and add that now. I'll press Shift A, and under color, I'm going to add the alpha over node, so right there. I'm going to put it in the middle of this noodle, and I am going to combine these two images by dragging or connecting this output port up to this input port. Actually, yes, that's the way it needs to be. So this render layers with the text will be above the background because the one that you want to be in front goes in the bottom port right there. Let's go ahead and see what this is going to look like when we actually render out. So I'm going to make a viewer node. So I'll press Shift A, and under Output, we're going to add a viewer node, which lets us see a backdrop. And I'm going to press Shift A. I'm going to add a layout rewrote node, which lets us put basically a little dot, which acts as a Y in the road. And now I can see how the render is going to look in the end. I'll hold Alt and orbit down so I can see that down here. Great. This is how the image would look if we wanted to have just the normal looking image with separate render layers, and that would be done. But we want to put an image in the background, and we also want to make this plane not show up as a color, but as the shadow only. So how we do this is a little bit complicated, but it only requires a few more nodes. What I'm going to do is I'm going to add a subtraction mix node. And what that means is I'm going to press Shift A, and under color we're going to add a mix node. And this basically gives us access to all of those blend modes that you might have seen before in Photoshop or GIMP, like dodge or burn or difference or subtract or multiply. In this case we'll be using subtract. And what that means is that we're going to be using a few different of these elements that we have access to, including shadow, because we enabled on that shadow only pass called shadow. That's why that one's available there and not up here. What we're going to do is take the two images that we get, including the alpha image and the shadow image. And of course, alpha means the transparency of the image, this checkerboard section, and combine them to make a mask that will include only the area where the shadows are, which we will then make black. So to understand this a bit more, I'm going to make this window a little bit wider. I'm going to drag this alpha out to our viewer, just so you can see what it looks like. This alpha image, or the alpha element of this render, is a mask essentially, which includes a white area where we can see things in this render, and a black area which represents transparency. This is just like a mask for this image. Okay, so we have a black area and a white area. Black is where transparency, where there's nothing, and white area is where there are objects in the scene that are not transparent. Let's see what this shadow render pass gets us access to. So I'll drag that one up to this viewer, and of course this viewer allows this backdrop to be possible. This shadow pass gives us a very similar image. It's black and white where there is transparency and where there are objects, but there is also now black, and there's also, it depends on our lighting, black and blurred gray where there is shadow, and that's important. Now this subtract node, what it can do is allows us to combine these two images. This one that you see, that's black and white with the shadows, and this one, whoops, pardon me, that one that only has black and white. I'm going to connect these two ports to these two input ports by clicking and dragging, of course. And let's see what we get now out of the result of this subtract mix node. That's what we get. We get an entirely black image with white shadow area. And the reason why that's happening, and this requires a little bit of understanding of how these blend modes work, is I'm going to move that out of the way for a sec, and I'll hold Control and left click and drag through those and drag through that one, is with this alpha pass, I'm going to connect it back up to the viewer, to the image of it rather. Subtract works by taking all of the two parts of the image, and it takes the first value and subtracts those colors or those shades away from the second image. So basically, if you have black in the first image up here and black in the second image up here, which we have for both, so that's true, if you take black away from black, you're left with black. There is nothing more to take away because black is basically zero in the terms of shades. Now white is, the actual number for white is 255. So if you subtract 0 from 0, well, you get just 0. So this part of the image will be black when you subtract this image from this image. Because those sections are black, you'll just get black. Now with this first image, we have white in this area. And if you subtract white from more white, you're taking away all of the white. You're taking away, hey, I have white in one image, and if I take all the white away from that image, I'm left with black. Now the interesting thing is that because this area is black, and if you're subtracting this part of the image from this part of this image, it's actually going to leave just white where that text is. Yes, it's confusing, but if you actually play around with these two images in Photoshop and subtract the top one, you'll actually see this result happen as well. Let's go ahead and connect these up, the alpha and the shadow, to the subtract node. I'm going to hold Control and drag through that noodle. The one more thing we have to add here, because now this subtract node gives us a good mask, we're going to make this mask actually act as a mask or an alpha channel. So I'm going to press Shift A. I'm going to add it's under Converter, I believe, and it's called Set Alpha. I'm going to drag that into this noodle right here, and I don't need to be connected to this viewer anymore, so I'll left click and drag, or hold Control and drag rather, and I'm going to connect that up to this image. Let's go ahead and connect these up and let's see what we get. We get almost the right thing. Oh, I believe I need to change where this subtract port goes. I'm going to drag it into this one instead and get rid of that one. So now we have, with this node set up, the shadow only 3D text with the shadows below the text and nothing else. This is what we want for our composite. Let's go ahead and adjust the shadows though. I'm not a fan of how these look, so I'm going to go back over to my 3D scene. I'll put these nodes back up in a moment. Right now my scene only has a point lamp. I'll press 0 to break out of my camera. That point lamp is terrible, especially in the Cycles render engine. So with the lamp selected over here under the lamp tab in the properties window, I'm going to go and change it to an area lamp, and I'm going to change the size of the area lamp to 5 and 5. And I'm going to rotate the lamp R on the Z axis, so I'll type R then Z, and I'm going to move it over here kind of above the camera so that our lighting improves. Let's go ahead and see how that looks. I'll render that back out under the camera tab. I'll click on render, and it's going to do 2 passes of course, and you're going to see it with the transparent background only, but you'll see how it looks right now. Because we're using an area lamp and I made it 5 by 5, which is a big, large light, we're going to get kind of nicer, softer shadows. And because it's pointing in that direction, the shadows are cast sort of backwards. Great. That's what we're going to put on top of the image of the dock. Let's go ahead and press Escape. It's at this point that I want to add that picture in. So I'm actually going to do that first over here in the 3D viewport. We're going to add a background to this viewport. So I'm going to press this little plus up here, or the N key on my keyboard, and down here I'm going to collapse some sections to not make this so confusing. Under background images, I'm going to check that little checkbox. We can actually add an image in the background over here by clicking on Add Image. I'm going to open the image that's on my desktop, and it's called wharf.jpg. It's an image that I took several weeks ago of a local wharf in my community. Let's go ahead now, and I'll press Z on my keyboard to break into wireframe view. In fact, what I'll do instead is I'm going to show, I'll just show Z wireframe mode so you can see kind of what that looks like. I'm going to scale that ground way down so you can kind of see what's going on here. Now, I want to make this scene match the perspective of my camera. I'm going to quickly make this a bit larger. I'm going to press N. Actually, it already was up. And I'm going to go to Display, or View rather, and I'm going to uncheck Lock Camera to View just so I can uncheck it so I can zoom and make this window bigger. And I'll check that again so I can orbit the camera again. What I want to do is make it look like this square belongs on the dock. And the way I'll do that is I'm going to scale it down so it kind of looks like it's just sort of a mat on the ground here. But as you can see, it's going to be tricky to match the perspective. And the best way I've found to do this is by making it a little bit longer, so it stretches down your ground a little bit longer. By the way, if you're on like a hill, it's going to be much harder to do this. If you're on a flat ground where you can see the edges of the walls, it'll help. I'm going to press Tab with this ground selected to go into edit mode, and then I'll grab this back edge, and I'm going to pull it back on the y-axis, and then go back into object mode with the Tab key. I can kind of orbit around now and kind of pan and zoom to make it look like I think it should. But actually this camera that I took this photograph with has a wider lens than our scene camera does. So I'm going to right click on the edge of this camera's frame, and over here under the camera tab I'm going to change the focal length of my camera to a lower number. And the reason I can tell that, the reason why I know how to do that, is because this plane is not getting small enough as it gets farther away, and that tells me that my real life footage, this image, is shot with a wider angle lens. That means that it has a shorter focal length. So I'm going to select the edge of the camera just by right clicking, and I'll change the focal length. In this case I know that it's 12, so I'll type 12 in and press enter. Which actually scales my scene down a whole lot. But now if I zoom back in and kind of I'll select this plane and orbit around, you'll see that it gets smaller as it gets farther away. And as you can see, it looks much more like it's actually sitting on the ground because it kind of follows the perspective of this outer image. This looks pretty good to me. I might orbit a little bit more, just like that. I'm going to go back into, actually what I'll do, I'll just press S to scale this, and then I'll press X on my keyboard to scale it only left and right. So that was S and then X, and then I'll drag this out and put it right about there. Great. I'm going to make this text a bit bigger, so I'll press S on my keyboard to scale that up, and that looks pretty good to me. Let's move that over and up here. I'll press R and then Z on my keyboard to kind of make that go backwards, and maybe I'll scale it back down so we can read it a bit better. I'll press Z to go back into solid view, and that looks pretty good to me. Maybe what I'll do is I'll make that float, so we'll see shadows underneath, and maybe I'll make this smaller so we can actually see it and rotate it again. Great. Okay, let's see how this looks when I actually render out. So I'll go to the camera tab and I'll click on render. Of course it'll do 2 passes, just the text, and then just the plane. And then because of my node setup, which I promise to put back on the screen in a moment, I see the composited image, but I didn't put the background image in. And that's because if I press escape, we've only added a background image in this window, but not composited using nodes. I'll press N to hide that panel. I'll go back to my nodes, and that's where I'll do a new alpha over to add in a background image. So I'll move these 2 nodes, or 3 nodes over, and I'm going to press Shift A, and under color we'll add an alpha over node, which lets us stack images. All this content, all these nodes render out our 3D scene. We're going to plug that into the bottom input image port of this alpha over, and I'll press Shift A. I'm going to add an input image node, and I'll connect that up there. I'm going to open, do I have access to it here? Yes, I do. I'll just click on this little image and select Wharf, and my render scale is wrong. Under dimensions, I'm going to scale, under the camera tab, I'm going to scale this up, and I might need to re-render, so I'll do that very quickly. Okay, so it's rendered out, and this is the result that I have right now. It looks pretty good, but actually I've changed my mind. I don't like how it's floating above the dock. I want to make it look like it's actually sitting on the dock. So I'll press escape, and over here in my scene, I'm going to move that text down just so it starts to go through the ground and move it back up again. Let's do a quick one more render to see how that looks. Great, so that looks quite good. I've actually just noticed that because this tail of the Y goes below that plane, but it still will show up under the ground. I don't like how that looks, so I'm going to go back into my 3D viewport and press Tab with my text selected to go back into edit mode. I'm going to make this into all caps just so we can see shadow only, just so we don't have any of that problem where it's going through the ground. In fact, I'm going to scale this up by quite a bit, and I'm going to rotate it on the Z-axis to go back into the background. Maybe just like that. RZ. Great. Okay, let's do one more render. Okay, so it's rendered out. I actually don't like the way this looks, but let's talk a moment about shadows. Right now, the shadows, we can't really see them, and it's going off the edge of that plane. But I don't want to actually make that plane any wider because there's an object right here, and I don't want to get into masking in this video. Let's press Escape, and I'll do a few things to make this a bit better. I'm going to select that text, and I'm going to add a material to it. So under the Materials tab, I'll click on New, and I'm going to make it a little bit darker than white. I'm going to make the text a bit smaller and facing the camera a bit more, so I'm going to press S to scale it down, and then R and Z, and then I'll move it over a little bit, and I'll scale it down and move it a little bit up to right about there. Great. Now there is a lamp in our scene. If I press 0 to break out of my camera, this lamp is quite large, and what that will do is it'll give me very soft shadows. If I have a sun in my scene and therefore very harsh shadows, because it's a cloudy day in this scene, the shadows are not very dark and crisp on the edge. They're very diffuse shadows. This works, a big lamp works, it creates diffuse shadows. If I want a much harsher light, I can make just a point lamp like I had before, or if I have an area lamp, I can just make it very small, like 1 by 1 and not 5 by 5. I can also click on Use Nodes, and I can make the strength of this lamp more. In fact, I'll do that. I'll type in maybe 300. That will look okay. I want to make sure that the shadows don't go visibly off and get cut off the edge of that plane like they looked before. Great, let's go ahead and do one more render, I promise, and then we'll talk about making the shadows look a little bit better for the scene by adjusting the parameters of the shadow, how big the shadows look, and how see-through they are, and then we'll do some color grading on the scene. So I will go to the Render tab and click on Render. Great, so I have the final image rendered out, but I want to adjust the shadows now and the brightness and contrast of the text to make it look like it fits better into the scene, because I have a very, very simple lighting setup, and I'll adjust the entire image to sell this effect. So I'm going to press Escape on my keyboard, and I'll press V to zoom out on that. In fact, I'll press Alt V to zoom back in with the background. Now, as promised, this is the node setup that we have right now. If you want to pause the video to get it, you can have it just by copying it into your own file. But to adjust shadows, and this is very, very powerful, I'm going to add an RGB curves node in a few important spots. I'm going to add an RGB color adjustment node into this part of the noodle right after it combines the two black and white images into one black and white, basically a mask, which we can then adjust over here. So I'll press Shift A on my keyboard, and I'm going to add a color RGB curves node. I'm going to add it right there. And what that will allow me to do, because this is only the shadows layer, is if I pull this end of this diagonal line to the right and let go, you can see it's actually, and I'll press Alt V, and then I'll hold Alt and pan over so you can see, it's actually going to shrink the shadows. It's making them not as expansive, and that will help with the edge there that looks like it's a bit cut off. And if I want to make the shadows themselves, or especially the darker parts of the shadows, more transparent, I can drag this tip of this diagonal line downwards, and it'll make, again, it more transparent. So it's really up to me, and just judging it just by eyeballing it, how I want these shadows to look compared to the shadows of other objects in the scene. This will really, really sell the image. That looks pretty good to me. Let's go ahead and do the same thing to the actual text. So over here, I'm going to add another RGB curves node under color right there. And this is where I can adjust any part of the image, rather this text, to sell the effect. In this case, I'm going to make it more contrasty just by moving these points around. I want it to look more bright and contrasty, so I'm not getting a result that I really want. That looks a little bit better to me. And in fact, because we have access to the different channels, I'm going to make this a little bit of a color I'm not sure what I'm going to do, but whatever looks good to me. There we go. I'm going to get rid of that red a little bit, I think. Oops. There we go. And I'll go back to the C, which stands for just brightness, and I'll turn that down a little bit. And that looks pretty good to me. So you can adjust a lot of separate things, and that's very powerful when you separate things into render layers. The last thing I'll do in this video is I'm going to add under the alpha over node, so basically right before we render out with our composite node, I'm going to add a color, and we're going to add a color balance node, and I'll put it right there. And what that will allow us to do, and you can add any adjustment color nodes that you want here. If I adjust the entire scene now, and I'm not going to get into how these work, you can play around with them for yourself. If you adjust the entire scene, especially the brightness and contrast and the colors, it'll sell the compositing work that you've already done. So there we go. I'm going to zoom out now. I'll press V on my keyboard and I'll do one final render. Great, so that's my final result. I'll go ahead and press escape on my keyboard so you can see the noodles and nodes again. I will hold Alt and pan the image away and make this window full screen so you can see the node setup. But that will be it for this video. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye bye.